Okay, colleagues, greetings and welcome back. So, hopefully this is going to be a relatively short video about Marx's concept of ideology. So I think I mentioned this elsewhere, that in many ways I feel that the concept of ideology in Marx is maybe the most important concept in all of Marx's writings, and definitely this is one of the things that has that got me interested in Marx in the first place. Over 15 years ago, I should say. And, I'm still here trying to grapple with this concept. Anyway, so trying to be short, concise, and to the point. So I want to watch a short clip, 5 minutes, and read a short passage, so with comments. So the video is going to be by Jamie Edwards. So I'll put a link in the description. Anyway, so before I go on to switch on the video, let me run you basically through the upshot of the video. So the first thing that Jamie is going to say is that Marx is not a prophet. It's important to remember that Marx is not God the Father or something like that, right? So Marx is a scholar, like all of us, I should say, right? And his views were evolving over a long period of time. So sometimes Marx is incomplete, and his account of ideology is incomplete. It's not necessarily a fully fledged account. These are difficult, complicated topics we're still grappling with today in the 21st century. So we wouldn't expect Marx to have the complete account, right? On the other hand, Marx sometimes may be inconsistent in the sense that he has changed his mind throughout the years. However, right, there's a certain idea, concept, notion of ideology which can be summarized from his views, and this is what Jamie is going to talk about. So the two things, broadly speaking, right? So we're going to be interested. Well, I mean, what is ideology? Ideology is the basic notion that there's a certain systematic misperception of reality, that we misperceive reality in a certain systematic way. Let me write this: systematic misperception of reality. And this is why I was interested in this so much when I was, a young student, in the bachelor's program, right? This notion that maybe we are wrong systematically. Maybe we cannot trust our own senses. Maybe we cannot trust what society around us tells us, right? And so, the way Jamie summarizes this is that most people or all people who knows, right? That their moral, political, legal, religious ideas are in some important respect false or at least inadequate with respect to reality as it really is, whatever that may be, right? And so the two things that we're interested in, one is going to be the origin of ideology, and Marx gives something like a genetic account, so a genetic account, or if you want, in Nietzsche in terms of genealogy, right? Where does ideology come from? And importantly, Jamie is going to stress this idea that there's a certain implicit, if you want, psychological bias in favor of the status quo. Not a simple thing to talk about. Even in the 21st century, even in 2021, right, our understanding of our understanding of the way the human mind works is far from perfect. So even to this day, there's and actually, if the link to the full 40-minute video is in the description. I definitely recommend you watch that. They go into a lot of interesting things about, for example, this replication crisis in psychology going on right now. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, they talk about that and link it to the conceptions of ideology in Marx. Anyway, so but this is the first issue, right? There's an origin of ideology. There's a certain genetic account. There's an implicit psychological bias in favor of the status quo, right? And second is that there's a function of ideology, right? The functional account, right? And basically that the ideology serves the interest of the ruling class, right? And another way maybe to phrase this, right, is there's a bottom-up account, that there's a certain psychological innate, I don't want to say innate, but automatic psychological status quo orientation, that we see things as they are, and we imagine that the way things are is the way they should be. So we are, like, our thinking, there's a tendency to reaffirm the status quo, right? And I mean, this is broadly speaking parallel to this genetic account, right? And the top-down account is that ruling class monopolizes the channels through which ideas are spread in society, and so they can select or favor the beliefs that support their interest. So again, there's a bottom-up and a top-down account. So this one is basically going to be genetic, and this one is going to be functional, right? Let me add this to the slide. Okay, is there anything else I want to say at this stage? Probably not, hopefully not. Yeah, and Jamie talks about this epistemological vicious circle that, sometimes, very importantly, right? Sometimes ideology may be a question of lie or fabrication. Sometimes, who knows, ideology may be like that, like an explicit conspiracy where the ruling elites are, or the ruling class in Marxist terms, withholds information or misinterprets information. But a much more important, much more insidious, much more interesting case, right, is that ideologists tend to be sincere, right? The example that Jamie and the host are talking about in the long form video, right? The example is slavery in the American South, right? And how there was this slave owner ideology which seemingly, as far as we can tell, quite sincerely tried to reconcile a certain, like an obvious contradiction, especially vis-a-vis the Christian faith, right? With respect to the practice of slave, completely dehumanizing practice of slave owning, right? And ideas along the lines of, again, ideology operates like this, right? You try to justify the status quo. You say the slaves deserve to be slaves, or maybe being a slave is actually good for the slave, or maybe the slave is not good for the slave, but the alternative is much worse. The alternatives are all much worse, and in this sense, it's not really good, but it's the lesser evil. It's an, if you want, yeah, okay. Let me add this necessary evil, necessary evil, right? And you can remember Aristotle and his account of slavery, right? So there's all sorts of things going on here. So that's the basic notion. This is the summary. Okay, so let me try to switch on the video. Is going to be 5 minutes, and we'll see how it goes from there.
Where you talked about how you wanted to see how cognitive biases, among other kinds of biases, can help to explain how ideologies of the dominant class or classes become widespread and become adhered to not only by the members of those classes, but by members of the classes they oppress as well. Is that, broadly speaking, correct?
Yeah, I think that's very well said. I think that captures it. I mean, the dissertation itself is sort of an articulation and a defense of Marx's whole view of ideology as I see it. So I see this as two pieces. Maybe it's just step back and say the two pieces, what these are. I mean, Marx said a lot of things about ideology. He didn't always explain thoroughly what he was talking about, and maybe some of his discussions are even inconsistent. But I think there's a through line that's interesting in Marx on ideology. And it's this thought that, to put it schematically, I would say that most of our moral, political, legal thinking is shot through with false beliefs, first. Second, there's an genetic account of why these beliefs go false. There's something about psychological influences, social circumstances that undermine the thinkers who are thinking these thoughts in this particular time, that leads them astray. And third, this sort of functional component, that these false beliefs then serve a function, basically, of supporting and sustaining the interests of a ruling class. So these are three components. They all need a lot more work, right, to be said. I mean, but the idea roughly is, so to put it maybe less schematically, the idea roughly is that any of us reflecting on the world around us, we're going to sort of have a status quo orientation to our thinking. We're going to reflect on the world in a way where the way things appear strikes us as the way things are and the way things should be, something like that. And that's going to affect us both as lay theorists, just ordinary folks, and professional theorists, those Marx calls ideologists, think moral philosophers, legal scholars, social scientists, etc. And that orientation is going to orient our beliefs in a way that sort of reaffirms the status quo. And to the extent that the status quo is set up such that it sort of favors elites, things that are going to reaffirm that are going to support and sustain those interests. That's what we might call, that's one half of the account, right? That's what I would call the bottom-up account. And this is the account where the social psychology, these things are going to be relevant. We can come back to that in a second. The more well-known part of the account, but I think is also important, so I'm not saying we should look here, not there. There's a second component. Marx thinks there is, in fact, I would call this the top-down account. I think we can call it that. There's a thought that there is, in fact, something like a ruling class. And this ruling class has monopolized essentially the channels through which ideas are circulated in a culture. And this ruling class, through this monopolization, selects among the beliefs that are sort of emerging those that are most, it selects the beliefs that support its interests the best, say. It promotes those, et cetera. So there's sort of a bottom-up and a top-down account, and it's sort of a vicious cycle epistemologically, right? The idea is, even without this top-down stuff, our thinking is going to be sort of directed in a way that reinforces the status quo. Worse still, there's going to be forces that are reinforcing that and channeling that back to us, right, in a way. So we're going to get kind of a double thing. We're going to already just have a psychological propensity to look around the world and sort of affirm it as it is. And then we're going to be getting this messaging on top of it that's like, and that's good. That's, that's right. That's the way things should be. It's the latter part that gets the most attention in Marxism. And I think that's, and again, I think that's crucial. I think that's a really important part. But sometimes in the discussions of ideology, it makes it seem like that would reduce it to just mere propaganda or something, like the ruling class cooks up these ideas. And this is not Marx's view. This is not the interesting part of Marxism. I mean, he thinks that happens, of course, as well. But the more interesting thought is the ideologists tend to be kind of sincere. The people who are reflecting and thinking about this, the people in the economics departments or the moral theorists or the theology people that Marx is criticizing, he's not thinking they're like cooking up schemes most of the time. Sometimes they are, but most of the time he thinks they're not like cooking up. They sincerely believe what they're saying. And so the question for Marx is, that's the interesting question in this domain, but under-theorized by him. The question is, how could that be the case? How could it be the case that sincere people who are purportedly experts in their relative fields could be theorizing in such a way that sort of systematically leads them astray? That's the thorny question. And that's where Marx, he suggests this, he points to cases where that seems to be what's happening. But what we don't have in Marx is account of how is that really possible? What are the mechanisms that could explain that sort of systematically distorting influence on our thinking? So that's where that's one half of it. And once we're there, then we still have the second half. Is there really a ruling class? Are they really, et cetera, et cetera? I think that's where a lot of this work goes. The first half of this work is to say, wait, is there any evidence that we could have our beliefs distorted in this way?
And that's what your work primarily focuses on, is the bottom-up part.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I do both parts, but I think...
Okay, so I hope I hope that this was, broadly speaking, illuminating. So, I wanted to...
I do both.
Get this out there. Wonderful video. I encourage you to watch it in its entirety. Again, it goes beyond some of the topics that they discuss. Go really beyond what we are covering in the course. But be that as it may. So, and to more or less finish us off for today, let me read a section from our wonderful textbook by Boucher and Kelly, right? So this is a chapter written by Paul Thomas. It's a chapter on Marx and Engels. So this is going to be a very short passage on ideology. So anyway, so Manifesto of the Communist Party, talking about various works that Marx writes about. And again, it's important to remember that Marx changes maybe his views of ideology from work to work. But anyway, the important idea is that, again, law, morality, and religion are, for Marx, so many bourgeois prejudice behind which lurk in ambush just as many bourgeois interests. And so, again, this point that ideology is motivated by interest, consciously or unconsciously. So in German ideology, very importantly, Marx and Engels talk about idealism as an ideology. Again, this notion of consciousness as an autonomous realm that admits of being studied and explained in its own terms, independently of social relations, right? This, for Marx, this is a misrepresentation of reality. Again, Marx keeps talking about how one does not judge a man by what a person thinks of themselves, right? You don't judge a person by what they think about themselves or by what they tell you about themselves, right? So in this very important sense, another huge topic that we're going to have to cover at some point, again, this relationship between materialism and idealism. Marx is going to say, again, it's not ideas that change the world, no? But there are objective material conditions, and there's a certain change in the economic base, and this provides the basis for the change of ideas. How exactly this happens is a complicated story. We have the functionalist account, for example, from Jerry Cohen. Again, we'll talk about this maybe some other time. But the important takeaway point is that this notion that, you hear this very often. People like on television will say, oh, if only we had better morals. Oh, if only we had better ideas. If only we had better ideals. If only society had better values. You hear this a lot, right? And so for Marx, this is ideology par excellence. This notion that if only you changed ideas, oh, then suddenly everything would be nice, right? If only you taught people how to be good to one another. Marx says competition or exploitation, for example, is not a result of this conscious action by people who are quote unquote evil, let's say. No, it is, exploitation or alienation are systematic problems and they require systematic solutions. The bourgeois are not essentially bad people. It's not like they have evil souls. No, there's a certain system of coercive laws of competition in the market that force people into certain positions, into certain situations, right? Anyway, so ideology here means idealism rather than apology, but in Marx's later works, bias and apology become defining features of ideology. So when we say apology, we don't mean apologizing, saying I'm sorry, really, right? But what we are meaning is defense. When we say apology, we mean defense. In political writings, ideological representatives of the bourgeoisie are straightforward apologists for bourgeois interests. In the economic writings, they tend to distinguish between such open, unashamed advocacy and the work of honest, disinterested investigators who might unintentionally idealize, justify, or absolutize something, right? So this is the important part. This is what Jamie was talking about. So this is the interesting bit of Marx's ideas. Not this blatant, straightforward lying or fabrication, right? But this unintentional misrepresentation, unintentional misperception or misunderstanding of reality. So these honest ideologists who are sincerely believing what they're saying, right? They universalize their points of view or forms of thought not because it is in their interest to do so, but because they find them natural or self-evident. This is important, right? So this is how ideology works, appearing natural or self-evident, right? Bias need not be intentional or self-interested, but if the bias is ideological, it will be slanted towards and will thus defend, legitimize, or speak for one group or class rather than another or others, right? This does not mean that ideology is the same as justification. Okay, this is sort of interesting technical point, but still I think important, worth mentioning, right? So Marx himself thought that capitalism was a great system. Marx justifies capitalism in the Communist Manifesto. Capitalism in many ways is the best thing that has happened to humanity ever, right? And capitalism lays down the necessary foundations for future communism. So in this sense, capitalism is hugely important for Marx, and there's a certain justification of capitalism, right? And Marx is prepared to admit enormous positive features of capitalism, progressive role of capitalism in human history. But he was not an apologist in the way that political economists like Adam Smith or Ricardo were, right? So to go back to this previous point, ideology is not defined simply by falsity or mendaciousness. An idea may be false without being ideological, and illusions have no necessary ideological function. Ideologies are rather always appropriate to those who profess them, whether or not these persons do so with the intent to deceive or mislead. Nor, again, are ideologies necessarily imposed on people. So ideologies are not necessarily imposed on people. They may be, so to speak, freely accepted by the people, accepted quite freely, right? As in the famous early characterization of religion as the opium of the people. Opium, after all, is taken freely, and as a rule, and not administered, right? So again, to maybe dwell on this for a moment, right? So religion is not the root of the problem for Marx. Religion is a symptom of the disease. Religion is not the cause of people's suffering or powerlessness. Religion is the symptom of people's suffering and powerlessness. People feel alienated, they are suffering, they feel powerless, and so they take refuge in religion. And this is why religion is conservative, and it's important maybe even to criticize religion. However, for Marx, ultimately, religion is not the root of the problem, right? And one should not attack religion for the sake of attacking religion, because properly speaking, right, what should happen for Marx is that as the material base of society changes, as people become actually less alienated or overcome alienation, as people become free, they lose interest in religion. Religion is supposed to wither away, not the same way, but in an analogous fashion, in which the state, the repressive apparatus of the state, is supposed to wither away. Anyway, now go back, right? So ideologies must be intelligible and appear to make sense to those who accept them, as well as to those who disseminate them. But the extent that ideologies are not instances of speculative idealism, but systematically biased bodies of thought, favoring some group or class over another or others, their merely intellectual inversion will not suffice to dislodge their hold. Again, so let's, I wish I could like underline this in red or something, right? So what is ideology, right? Ideology is a system, or system of ideology is a systematically systematically biased body of thought favoring some group or class over another or others. Let's try to highlight this. Can I? Yeah. Okay. Different color. Wonderful. Yeah. So this is in many ways, this is the most important takeaway point. So the last thing I very briefly wanna talk about is I mean, hopefully so far all of this was clear and hopefully useful to some extent. The last thing I want to very briefly just mention as a postscriptum. Sean Carroll has recently done an interview about visibility and invisibility. So this is a book by a scholar whose name is, I think, Zia Tong. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Zia Tong. And so she talks about realities that we don't see. And this is just, like, I want to keep this as short as possible, right? So the idea, like, when we think about this, how ideology, there's a certain natural psychological bias towards the status quo, right? So when we think about serfdom, right? So relationships between lords and serfs, obviously there's something deeply unpalatable about certain people being able to own others, being able to buy, to sell them, being able to, punish them, whip them at will, right? So there's a certain clearly coercive and very distasteful, cruel element of relationship between lords and serfs. Similarly cruel element of relationships between slave owners and slaves, right? Likewise, under capitalism, there's a cruel element. There's a cruel, coercive, unseemly element. There's all sorts of facets of capitalism that we don't want to look at, that we don't want to think about, that it's not pleasant to dwell on for most, let's say, anatomically normal human beings. So most people, when they see things like, sweatshops, in general, people forced to work on the pain of starvation, the way that, iPhones are produced, the way that, clothing and, mining industry, but also very importantly, trash disposal. So capitalism produces enormous amounts of trash as it is producing goods, right? But also as it disposes of old goods, which have become obsolete or obsolescent, right? And so there's the beautiful side of capitalism. We have cameras, we have surveillance cams everywhere, right? And people maybe go to YouTube or something like that, right? And watch live streams of cherry blossoms in Japan, or Swiss Alps, and scenic railways. This is what we want to look at, right? So there are beautiful advertisements, right? On buildings or on television. There's a certain image, right? But there's also another part of capitalism, the huge garbage dumps. Children in Africa mining resources for lithium-ion batteries, that kind of thing, right? Or again, sweatshops in China or in Southeast Asia, right? And this is also part of capitalism. This is an essential part of capitalism. Again, if you look around this room, if you look around the room that you are in right now, a lot of things I bet have been made in China. Who knows who and when is going to watch this video, right? But as I am looking around my room, and as I'm looking at the microphone through which I'm speaking to you right now, it's made in China under conditions which are definitely not free. This is definitely not voluntary division of labor, or definitely, as far as I can tell, unfortunately, right? But we don't want to look at that, right? And this is what Sean Carroll is talking about with Zia Tong. Basically, that there are surveillance cams in certain places and certain things are visible, but other things, other realities, like the garbage dumps, like the sweatshops, are invisible. So Marx actually emphasized this point, that the marketplace, the commodity exchange, is highly visible, but the realm of production is invisible. Nobody is allowed into the shop floor. Trade secret. Nobody's supposed to see sometimes, especially in Marx's own day, the appalling conditions under which people are working, right? So there's a certain natural tendency, and again, like I'm not trying, this is very important. Marx is talking about structural features. We're not playing the blame game. This is not judgmental, right? Most people would prefer not to dwell on these realities. Most people, when they come home from work or something like that, right? When they switch on the television, they don't want to see the suffering of workers and the pollution of the environment. Like we don't. It's natural, and I don't think as a person interested in Marxism, as a person interested in Buddhism, I don't think that we should blame people for not wanting to watch, right, the dark side of capitalist production and the dark side of capitalist accumulation. But it is there. It is there, right? And it serves the status quo, and it serves, the perpetuation of capitalist system, right? Well, anyway, I don't mean to depress people too much. The goal of our course is first and foremost understanding. Anyway, I should probably finish here because I think I've said everything I wanted to relating to Marx's ideology. I try to keep this video as short as possible. So let me pause here, but I'll come back with more videos on Marx and on other philosophers that we need to cover. So colleagues, thank you for joining me today. I hope this was stimulating.